joking
is not
style.
right with that boy.
Mikami simply replied that he thought
Dude
dinosaurs
is
were cool.
real
But it can't be
serious.
ignored that
Did you
just
see
a
how
few
he
years
freaked out
earlier,
in the water?
Jurassic Park 2: The Lost World,
Yeah, he was like
which took the dinosaur setting of the
was like a
first film
fish
and delivered a much
out of
darker
water.
sequel with a lot more violence
Right.
and intensity.
Sure.
Considering Mikami's love for that genre and his
something was weird
propensity
when I
to
tried
be
to clean his
influenced
wounds,
by
too,
things he
at the
watched and
lodge.
played,
What do you
I think
mean?
it's safe to say it was a big influence
All of his clothes are
on his
bloody, but
decision
I
to
couldn't
make
find where he
Dino
was bit
Crisis.
or
He
scratched or
dubbed the
whatever.
change of pace
He just kept
panic
moving
horror,
around, like
a
he
nod
didn't
to
want me
the
to see how
survival
badly he
horror
was
term
hurt.
that Capcom had used to advertise Resident Evil. He claimed that if Resident Evil was horror in a
He's not
fun
frothing in the
house,
mouth.
Dino Crisis
I think
was
Abby
horror
would beg
on
to
a
differ.
roller coaster.
Boy.
It eventually released in July
Yeah, isn't
1999
aquaphobia a symptom
to
of
great
rabies?
reviews, averaging 84 out of 100 and selling
Hydrophobia, yeah.
extremely
But I think it's more
well,
about a fear
particularly in
of
Japan,
drinking,
where
not
it was
just
one of the
getting
best
wet.
selling
This
games
was
of
like
the year.
like
By
my
the time
cat
its
in the
publishing
bathtub.
run ended, it had shipped a massive 2.4 million copies and gone platinum on PlayStation 1. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's dive into the game itself and look at just why Dino Crisis made such an impact and why its reputation is still so huge so many years later.
Of course.
Dino Crisis is one of the purest horror action games ever made, with barely an ounce of video game fat on the scaly body,
Nick.
and gets straight to the point.
Please, just tell
We
me.
start out with a pretty cool retro PC-style mission briefing being delivered as a quick sat on the desk. The report comes from an agent codenamed Tom, who's made a startling discovery while undercover in the Borginian
Enjoyed
Republic.
spending time with you
He'd been
this summer.
tasked with investigating a secret research centre on Iris Island, and while he hadn't discovered an equally valuable
What?
prize. The research centre is being run by the infamous Dr. Kirk, whose experimental work on an unlimited energy source called Third Energy has made him the envy of every government in the world.
What?
He had been thought dead and the research lost forever, but with the discovery that he's alive and that his experiments are going well, the United States government goes into full imperial thief mode and they dispatch the Special Operations Raid Team to bring the Doctor into American custody.
Nick.
We meet our gang
Do
of
you like
glorious 90s CGI as they helicopter over the island and parachute down into the jungle surrounding the facility. Despite losing one of their group
I am telling you the
we're
truth.
quickly introduced to agents Gale, Rick, and our controllable main character, Regina, as they immediately begin a hunt for Dr. Kirk and his mysterious research. If you thought there would be some tension or mystery about that missing agent, remember, Dino Crisis doesn't fuck around, and almost immediately we're treated to another glorious CGI cutscene of our missing teammate,
This
Agent
isn't you.
Cooper,
I mean,
running for his
this
life
isn't
from
you.
Rex, which easily chases him down, chews him up, and stands before a full moon.
Whoa, Abby!
Abby, everything okay?
Holy shit.
And it's mere minutes before we're confronting our own Dino terrors. Once the team arrives at the research centre, Rick, who's the team's electronics specialist, heads off to disable the facility's security systems, and Gale, who's in charge of the mission, orders Regina to sweep the area and work out how to get power back. So we head over to the backup generator room, and after solving a little puzzle to get around my Regina leaves the room to find Gale's sudden mission, and is immediately attacked by one of the game's massive raptors. We try to put some bullets into it, but these are not soft-skinned zombies, and the only way is to run away, which is far better than it sounds, as they are damn fast. Terrorize the hearts of any veteran Regina finally does get away from the monster and heads into the facility, quickly meeting up with them in the control room, where they try to work out what exactly is going on and what exactly they should do. Rick wants to radio in the chopper, but as Cooper had their communications gear, they're trapped, leaving only one option: continue with the mission and try to locate Dr. Kirk. Regina agrees to head out into the dinosaur-infested facility, while Rick disables the security shutters and provides radio support. You step out of the control room and into the game proper, with a facility to explore, dinosaurs to kill. The most important thing we need to deal with out of the blocks is the perception that this is just Resident Evil with dinosaurs, because we'd be forgiven for thinking that that's all this game really is. After all, the premise is almost identical. All the familiar mechanics make a return, from the fixed camera perspective and tank controls, limited ammunition and inventory space, puzzles that need to be solved, backtracking that needs to be done, and a whole lot of memos to read in order to work out the narrative. Hell, we even get a little door opening animation when we go into a different room, so it's not a comparison that we can pretend isn't valid. Thing is, I consider Dino Crisis to be an evolution of the formula that Mikami put together in Resident Evil 1, rather than a simple rehash. If Resident Evil 2 is the original concept, but bigger and more ambitious, with more zombies and more areas and more bosses, Dino Crisis is the same formula, but refined, stripped of what didn't work and rebuilt with creative new twists. A sequel not in terms of narrative, but in terms of design philosophy. In that sense, I suppose, it literally is Resident Evil 1 with dinosaurs. But as we'll find out, that is a pretty damn good proposition. Before we dive too far into its design, I want to take a little detour and talk about the tank controls and fixed perspective that I'm sure is already putting a lot of people off from ever giving this game a chance. I think a large amount of the criticism and fear of this system comes from a fundamental misunderstanding about how it's supposed to work. So often you hear that it's clunky or difficult to dodge enemies, or frustrating because you might take hits or miss doors in the heat of the moment. But that's sort of the point. A huge amount of tension in these games comes from the fact that you can't reliably encounter enemies without sometimes taking damage. And the movement system is a huge part of that. Having extremely snappy and responsive controls would massively limit the danger you find yourself in. And in a survival horror game, which revolves entirely around limited health and hyper-dangerous enemies, that simply doesn't work. To use the most cliche analogy, it's like complaining that the iframes of the
Why don't you get that rinse and rinse them in the sink in the kitchen, in the bathroom?
Yeah, it does lead to a lot of deaths, but that's the whole point. You're supposed to get better at it over the course of the game, and it's supposed to have a degree of danger baked into it. There's sadly been a homogenization of video game controls over the last decade, and I think it means that people expect to have a level of proficiency with any game they pick up, and that's just not an idea that existed in the 90s. Standards like shooting being on a trigger or jump always being on an X or A button are relatively new concepts, and in the era Dino Crisis comes from, you pick up a game and really have to learn how it worked. Ultimately, there will always be people who aren't convinced by this movement system, but I think there are a huge amount of clear positives to it, and the difficulty that most people have with it is always quite grossly overstated. If you can beat a few bosses in Dark Souls or get past a level in Doom Eternal, there's absolutely no reason you shouldn't be able to get your head around tank controls and be racing around the halls of Ivycycle before you know it. So with that out of the way, let's talk about a few of the ways that Dino Crisis distinguishes itself from its spiritual father. The most obvious is that all of the environments are now fully 3D, rendered with a real-time engine. It gives everything a very cohesive look, as items and objects that you can interact with don't garishly stick out from the background, and instead look natural, which encourages you to interact with the world in a more authentic
It's just
way.
a rinse.
You
Just to
check
rinse your mouth
computers
off.
and folders for clues, hit wall switches and terminals to open doors because that's what Regina would do, rather than running around a room mashing X while you're trying to find something to interact with. The biggest benefit by far is that the fully 3D environment means that the Mikami's team can get a lot more ambitious with the camera. We're no longer rooted to a single angle in each zone. There are a handful of really nice panning camera angles, usually in long corridors or outside zones, where Regina's movement is tracked by the camera, and they look so good compared to the constant flickering
So,
perspective of the
if I were a counselor,
It doesn't
having
sound like
off
much,
season
but those little zooms
partying
or
around
slight
a
shifts in the
bonfire,
camera just smooth
and it
everything
started to
out
rain,
and reduce some of the jarring
and
feeling that
there were
fixed cameras can
monsters,
sometimes cause when you're
I
quickly moving from
would
place to
go
place. The 3D engine also means a lot more of the world can actually serve
to the lodge.
functional purposes, and this is huge for the game's meant puzzles. Instead of simply collecting keycards or coloured gems, the facility's many brain scratches are now usually done with their own little 3D mechanics. They can be anything from lowering coloured pipes to provide airflow to a machine, operating a crane to lift shipping containers out of the way, or using zero-G experimental machinery. Each work is its own little puzzle minigame, and all are realised
Ryan
in
stories
3D,
again.
something that would have never have been possible Resident
I had no
Evil
idea kids were
slideshow
getting
engine.
freaked out about this
Again, it
stuff.
just adds massively to
We
your
officially suck as
immersion. And as
counselors.
ridiculous as some of these puzzles can get, the fact that they feel cohesive with the rest of the world prevents them from feeling like a strange side activity. It's not just all functional improvements though, as the in-game cutscenes are miles better than the puppet show style conversation scenes from Mikhail's last game. We get a lot of different angles with characters moving around and even little chunks of action, all enabled because it's taking place within the game area rather than on a JPEG stage. It does a fantastic job of maintaining the spy thriller cinematic tone. It means that the narrative is nicely split three ways between action-heavy CGI cutscenes, in-game conversations, and the text memos that fill in the gaps. The element that holds all of this narrative variety together is the surprisingly talented cast of voice actors who put in a frankly sterling job considering the standards in their professions at the time. Each character is extremely memorable, with tons of personality bursting out the lines they deliver, and Morgenstern's performance as Regina particularly stands out. Magic Girl fans out there might even recognise her as the iconic voice of Mina from Sailor Moon. Well, some of that energy definitely shines through in her character as well. She's just as strong and capable as any of the male agents, but she throws in the odd jokey comment and isn't afraid to call out the nonsense happening around the team for what it is. Personally, I think she's up there with Lara Croft and Jill Valentine as one of the most iconic female leads in a PlayStation game. Morgenstern's performance has a lot to do with that. Possibly my biggest issue with the entire game is simply that there's no option for subtitles, and the mix during some of the cutscenes is just ever so slightly off, which annoyingly does mask some of the lines. There's nothing worse than feeling like you're strained to hear what characters are saying, and it's easily the game's biggest misstep. Luckily, it's more than made up for by the rest of the game, which is full of clever design, and none better than the raptors and dinosaurs that stalk the hallways of Ibis Island. They present a wholly different challenge to the zombies of Resident Evil, and really give Dino Crisis a very different feel. That panic horror phrase might seem like marketing nonsense, but the more time you spend doing battle with these creatures, the more it becomes apparent that panic horror is actually a pretty accurate description of what these encounters feel like.